At the beginning, the avoidant convinces themselves they are in control. That's the story they tell, internally and sometimes out loud. This is the right decision. I need space. This is too much. And on the surface, it can even look rational. They distance, they withdraw, they detach. They believe they've protected their peace, preserved their independence, and avoided emotional overwhelm. But what they're really doing is managing discomfort, not solving it. Control in this context is not strength. It's avoidance disguised as clarity. Because real control would require staying present in the face of emotional intensity. It would mean communicating honestly, tolerating vulnerability, and working through discomfort instead of escaping it. But that's not what happens. Instead, they create distance and call it self-respect. They shut down and call it boundaries. They walk away and call it clarity. And for a while it works. There's relief in the beginning. A kind of emotional silence. No more difficult conversations, no more feeling exposed, no more pressure to meet someone at a deeper level. It feels like freedom. And that's the trap, because the absence of discomfort is mistaken for the presence of peace. But peace built on avoidance is temporary. What they don't realize is that emotions don't disappear just because they're ignored. They don't dissolve because you've chosen distance. They go underground. They wait. And over time, they build pressure. Because the connection they walked away from wasn't insignificant. It was real. It was impactful. And it left an imprint. So slowly, subtly, something begins to shift. The silence they once craved starts to feel different. It's no longer peaceful. It's empty. The space they created begins to echo. And in that quiet, without distraction, without emotional noise to run from, they're left with something they didn't expect: awareness. And awareness is where the illusion of control begins to break. Because now they start to question their own narrative. Was it really too much? Or was it just unfamiliar? Did they truly lose themselves in the connection? Or did they finally get close to something real and not know how to handle it? These are not comfortable questions. In fact, they're the very questions they were trying to avoid in the first place. You said true precise to presser ewisterol. But once they surface, they don't go away. This is the turning point, the moment where control gives way to truth. And truth doesn't negotiate with avoidance. It doesn't soften itself to protect the ego. It shows you clearly what you had, what you did, and what it cost. And this is where regret quietly begins, not as a dramatic realization, but as a slow recognition that the thing they thought they were escaping was actually the thing that mattered. Because control, when rooted in fear, always comes at a price, and the price is connection. The very thing they tried to protect themselves from losing is the very thing they end up losing. And when that realization fully lands, it changes everything. Because they don't just see that they walked away, they understand that they walked away from something meaningful, something rare, something that may not come back in the same form again. And that's the moment the illusion collapses completely. Because they were never in control. They were just running. And sooner or later, you don't escape what you avoid. You return to it with interest. And then something even more powerful happens, something the avoidant rarely anticipates, because it doesn't come from what you do, but from what you stop doing. You go quiet. Not as a strategy, not as manipulation, but as a shift. You stop chasing clarity. You stop over-explaining your intentions. You stop trying to fix what they were never willing to face. And in that moment, something fundamental changes in the emotional dynamic. Because where there was once constant reassurance, there is now stillness. And that stillness is not empty, it's loud. You see, avoidants are often comfortable in relationships where the other person carries the emotional weight, where someone else initiates the conversations, pushes for connection, and keeps the bond alive. It allows them to stay at a distance while still benefiting from closeness. But when you step back, when you remove that energy entirely, you disrupt the system they unconsciously relied on. Now there's no one reaching in, no one bridging the gap, no one softening the silence. And for the first time, they are left alone with it. This is where your silence becomes confronting. Not because silence itself is aggressive, but because it removes all distraction. It forces a kind of psychological exposure. There's no more external noise to focus on, no messages to respond to, no emotional cues to deflect, just space. And in that space, something begins to surface. They start to notice the absence, not just of communication, but of presence, of warmth, of consistency, of someone who, despite everything, kept showing up. And what once felt overwhelming now starts to feel significant, because absence has a way of clarifying value. When something is always there, it's easy to underestimate it, to assume it will continue regardless of how you treat it. But when it's gone, truly gone, not temporarily withdrawn, it creates a contrast that the mind can't ignore. And that contrast is where realization begins. They may not admit it immediately. In fact, they often resist it at first. They'll tell themselves you've moved on too quickly or that the connection wasn't as deep as it felt. They might even try to reinforce their original decision, clinging to the idea that distance was necessary. But your silence doesn't argue. It doesn't defend itself. It simply remains. And over time, that consistency in your absence becomes more powerful than any words you could have said. Because now, they're the ones left interpreting the silence. They're the ones filling in the gaps. And without your emotional input guiding the narrative, they're forced to confront their own thoughts, unfiltered, uninterrupted. This is where discomfort turns into introspection. They begin to ask questions they once avoided. Why didn't I try harder? Why did I pull away when things were real? Why does this feel heavier now than it did before? These questions don't come all at once. They build gradually like pressure beneath the surface. And the longer the silence holds, the more undeniable it becomes. Because silence, when it's rooted in self-respect, carries a different kind of energy. It's not reactive. It's not emotional in the chaotic sense. It's grounded. Final, it signals that something has shifted, not just in behavior, but in identity. You are no longer the person who waits. And that realization hits deeper than any confrontation ever could. Because now, it's not about what they chose to do, it's about what they can no longer access. The connection hasn't just paused, it has transformed beyond their reach. And in that awareness, something inside them begins to move. Not toward you necessarily, but toward the truth. That your silence wasn't a loss of interest. It was the end of tolerance. And by the time they fully understand that, the distance between you is no longer just physical or emotional. It's irreversible. Because the loudest message you ever send is the one you don't. And just when it seems like the silence has settled into something permanent, another layer begins to unfold. One that explains why everything you've seen so far doesn't happen immediately, but instead arrives with a delay that feels almost calculated. Avoidants don't process emotions in real time. In the moment, when things are intense, when connection deepens, when vulnerability is required, that's when they disconnect. Not because they don't feel, but because they feel too much and don't have the internal framework to hold it. So instead of engaging, they suppress. They compartmentalize. They move on quickly, or at least appear to. And from the outside, it can look like indifference. It can feel like you meant very little, like what you shared didn't register. Because while you were processing the connection as it happened, feeling it, investing in it, trying to understand it, they were managing it by minimizing it. But here's what most people don't understand. Suppressed emotion doesn't disappear. It delays. It waits for a moment when the environment is quiet enough, when the distractions fade, when the nervous system is no longer in avoidance mode. And then, often unexpectedly, it resurfaces. This is where the delayed emotional processing begins. Days later, weeks later, sometimes even months later, something triggers a memory, a song, a place, a moment of stillness, and suddenly the emotions they bypassed earlier come rushing back, but this time without the buffer of distance or denial. And now, they're not just feeling the connection. They're feeling the loss of it. That's a very different experience. Because in the beginning, when they walked away, they were operating from relief. Relief from pressure, from expectation, from emotional intensity. But now that relief has worn off. And what replaces it is something far more difficult to ignore. Contrast. They start to compare how they feel now to how they felt with you. The emotional presence, the consistency, the depth, all the things that once felt overwhelming now begin to take on a different meaning. Not as pressure, but as value. And this is where it hits harder than they expect. Because they're no longer reacting to you. They're responding to their own internal experience, one they can't control in the same way they controlled the relationship. There's no conversation to exit, no message to ignore, no situation to physically leave. This is internal. And internal experiences don't respond to avoidance the same way external ones do. So the emotions build, not in a chaotic, explosive way, but in a steady, undeniable presence. A kind of emotional gravity that pulls their attention back to what they tried to escape. They begin to feel regret, but not just as a thought, as a sensation, a weight, a tension, a quiet realization that sits with them in moments they can't distract themselves from. And what makes it more intense is the timing, because by now, you've already begun to move differently. You've started to heal, to detach, to reorient your life without them at the center of it. So while they're just beginning to feel the depth of what was lost, you're already stepping out of it. And that misalignment creates a kind of psychological urgency. They want to understand it, revisit it, sometimes even reach back toward it. But the version of you that held space for their inconsistency, that version no longer exists in the same way. And deep down, they sense that, which makes the emotional processing even more confronting. Because now it's not just about what they feel, it's about what they can no longer fix. This is the cost of delayed awareness. When you postpone emotional truth, it doesn't arrive gently. It arrives all at once, layered with everything you refused to face earlier. And by the time it does, the context has changed. The person has changed. The opportunity has changed. And you're left trying to process something that no longer exists in the form you remember. That's why this stage is so powerful, because it's no longer about avoidance. It's about confrontation. Not with you, but with themselves. And when that confrontation becomes unavoidable, it leaves them with a realization that's both simple and heavy. You can delay your feelings, but you can't escape their timing. And as those delayed emotions begin to settle into awareness, the mind does something it always does when it's trying to make sense of loss. It goes back. Not forward, not outward. Back. They start replaying the connection. At first, it's subtle, a passing thought, a brief memory triggered by something ordinary. But then it becomes more consistent, more detailed, more immersive. Moments that once felt small begin to take on a different weight. Conversations they barely acknowledged at the time now feel significant. The way you showed up, the way you responded, the way you stayed, even when it wasn't easy, starts to reorganize itself in their mind. Because memory is not static. It evolves with awareness. And now that their awareness has expanded, so does their interpretation of what you meant to them. They don't just remember what happened, they begin to understand it. They revisit the moments where you were patient, where you tried to communicate, where you made an effort to meet them emotionally, and what once felt like pressure now looks like presence. What once felt overwhelming now feels intentional. They start to see that what they were resisting wasn't dysfunction, it was depth. And that realization shifts everything. Because now, the narrative they used to justify their distance begins to unravel. It's harder to tell themselves that it wasn't right, or that it wouldn't have worked, when the evidence of something real keeps surfacing in their own memory. And memory, when it's emotionally charged, doesn't just inform, it pulls. They begin to loop through specific moments. The way you looked at them when you felt close. The conversations where something genuine was exchanged. The times you offered understanding instead of judgment. These aren't grand, dramatic scenes. They're often quiet, almost ordinary interactions, but they carry emotional truth. And emotional truth is what lingers. This is where regret starts to take on a sharper edge, because it's no longer abstract. It's tied to real experiences, real choices, real missed opportunities. They don't just feel that they lost something, they can see exactly where and how it happened. The moments they withdrew instead of leaning in. The times they dismissed something that deserved attention. The space they created when closeness was actually being offered. And the more they replay it, the clearer it becomes. You weren't asking for too much. You were offering something they didn't know how to receive. That's a difficult realization to sit with, because it shifts responsibility. It moves the focus away from external circumstances and places it directly on their internal limitations. Not as blame, but as truth. And truth, when it's seen clearly, doesn't leave much room for denial. So they keep going back. Not because they want to suffer, but because the mind is trying to resolve something unfinished. It's trying to reconcile the gap between what they had and how they handled it. But here's the paradox. They can revisit the memory, but they can't re-enter the moment. They can analyze it, reinterpret it, even feel it more deeply now than they did then, but they can't change their response within it. The version of themselves that made those decisions is no longer the same, but the consequences of those decisions remain. And that's where the weight of it really lands. Because now, they're not just remembering you, they're recognizing you. The value, the consistency, the emotional depth, you're no longer filtered through their avoidance. You're seen with a kind of clarity that only comes after loss. And that clarity doesn't bring relief. It brings perspective. A perspective that often arrives too late to restore what was there, but early enough to reshape how they understand themselves moving forward. Because once you truly see the significance of something you lost, you can't unsee it. And that awareness stays with you. It follows you into future connections, into future decisions, into the quiet moments where you're forced to ask yourself a simple but confronting question. Why did I only understand its value once it was gone? And as that recognition deepens, something even more confronting begins to take shape, because it's no longer just about the memories themselves, but about what those memories reveal. They begin to recognize your value. Not in the abstract, not as a vague idea of you were good to them, but in a precise, almost uncomfortable clarity. The way you showed up consistently, the way you communicated, even when it was difficult, the emotional availability you offered without guarantees, the patience you extended when things were uncertain. These qualities, which once felt excessive or even overwhelming to them, now stand out as rare. And rarity changes perception. What once felt like too much now feels like something they can't easily find again. Because when you're not ready for depth, you interpret it as pressure. But when you've lost it, you begin to understand it as value. And that shift doesn't happen all at once. It unfolds gradually as they encounter other people, other dynamics, other connections that don't carry the same weight, the same presence, the same sense of emotional safety you provided. They start to notice the difference. Conversations that stay on the surface, inconsistency that once felt normal, a lack of effort that mirrors what they themselves once gave. And in those moments, there's a quiet comparison happening, not always consciously, but consistently. They're measuring what is against what was, and what was starts to stand apart. Because you didn't just offer attention, you offered intention. You didn't just react, you engaged. You didn't just stay, you invested. And those are not common traits. They require emotional maturity, self-awareness, and a willingness to be present even when it's uncomfortable. At the time, they didn't have the capacity to fully receive that, so they minimized it. They told themselves it wasn't aligned, that it was overwhelming, that it didn't feel right. But now with distance and reflection, those interpretations begin to feel incomplete, even inaccurate. Because the more they understand themselves, the more they see that what they were rejecting wasn't a flaw in you. It was a limitation in them. And that realization carries weight, not because it creates guilt in a dramatic sense, but because it introduces accountability. A quiet acknowledgement that something meaningful was offered, and they didn't meet it with the same level of presence. And here's where it becomes even more difficult to ignore. They start to understand that your value wasn't based on what you gave them, it was based on who you were. Your consistency wasn't dependent on their behavior. Your depth wasn't a reaction to their effort. It was inherent, which means it wasn't easily replaceable. And that's the part that lingers. Because now it's not just about missing you. It's about recognizing that what you brought into their life required a certain level of readiness, a level they didn't have at the time. And readiness is not something you can fake. You either meet it or you miss it. They missed it. And that truth doesn't need to be loud to be powerful. It sits in the background of their awareness, influencing how they see past decisions, how they approach future connections, how they interpret emotional depth when they encounter it again. Because once you've experienced something real, even if you didn't handle it well, you carry the imprint of it. You know the difference. And knowing the difference changes you. It removes the illusion that all connections are equal. It challenges the idea that something meaningful can always be replaced with something convenient. It forces a reevaluation of what actually matters, not in theory, but in lived experience. And often, that reevaluation comes with a quiet realization that's difficult to escape. You weren't hard to love. You were just given to someone who didn't yet understand how to love you properly. And by the time they do understand it, by the time they can finally see your value without distortion, one truth stands in front of them, undeniable and unchangeable. Recognition when it comes too late doesn't restore what was lost. It only teaches you what you should have protected. And while all of this is unfolding on their side, the realization, the replaying, the recognition, something equally powerful is happening on yours. But it moves differently. It's not delayed. It's not reactive. It's intentional. You begin to grow, not in a loud performative way, not to prove a point or to make them see what they lost, but because at some point you're faced with a decision, stay attached to the pain or move through it. And when you choose to move through it, everything starts to shift. At first, it's uncomfortable. Let's be honest about that. Healing isn't clean. It doesn't follow a straight line. There are moments where you question yourself, where you revisit the past, where you try to make sense of what happened. But the difference is you don't stay there. You process it. You allow the emotions to move instead of suppressing them. You sit with the discomfort instead of escaping it. And in doing that, you develop something the avoidant never allowed themselves to build in that relationship: emotional resilience. Your sisters. And resilience changes how you see everything. You begin to understand that the connection, as meaningful as it was not the only source of your worth. You start to separate your identity from the outcome. What they did, how they responded, why they pulled away, it stops defining you. And that's a powerful shift, because now your energy is no longer focused on being understood by someone who couldn't meet you. It's focused on understanding yourself. Your standards become clearer. Your boundaries become stronger. Your awareness becomes sharper. You don't just heal, you evolve. And evolution creates distance, not just physical or emotional distance from them, but psychological distance from the version of you that once tolerated less than you deserved. The version that overextended, overexplained, overinvested without reciprocity. That version of you begins to fade. And in its place, something more grounded emerges. Someone who still has depth, still has empathy, still has the capacity to love, but now with discernment, now with clarity. Now with the understanding that connection is not just about feeling, it's about alignment. And this is where the dynamic fully shifts. Because while they're sitting in reflection trying to piece together what they lost, you're no longer in the same place emotionally. You're not waiting for closure. You're not hoping for a different outcome. You've already begun creating one. And that's what makes the contrast so stark. They're looking back. You're moving forward, and growth, real growth, is not something you can reverse just because someone else has finally caught up to a realization. Once you've seen things clearly, once you've felt the impact, processed it, and chosen to rise from it, you don't go back to being who you were before. You can remember it, you can understand it, but you don't re-enter it. And that's often the hardest part for them to accept. Because by the time they reach the point of clarity, by the time they understand your value and the weight of their choices, they expect, consciously or not, that something might still be there to return to. But what they don't fully grasp is this. You didn't just heal from the connection. You outgrew the version of yourself that needed it in that form. And that changes the equation entirely. Because now, even if they were to come back with awareness, with intention, with a different mindset, you're no longer operating from the same emotional space. You're no longer responding from longing or attachment. You're responding from clarity. And clarity doesn't negotiate with what once hurt you. It honors what you've become. So while they sit with regret, you sit with understanding. While they replay the past, you build something new. And while they try to reconcile what they lost, you no longer measure your life by it. That's the final shift. Not that they realize your value, but that you realize your own. And once that realization is fully integrated, there's nothing left to prove, nothing left to revisit, nothing left to chase, because growth doesn't wait for regret to catch up. It moves on. So, when an avoidant finally realizes the weight of what they destroyed, it is often too late. They come face to face with the truth they once ran from, the truth of your presence, your depth, your consistency, and the way you loved when they could not. They begin to process the emotions they ignored, replay the moments they dismissed, and recognize your value too late to restore what was lost. But here's the critical truth. While they are trapped in delayed awareness, regret, and reflection, you are not. You've moved through the pain. You've honored your emotions. You've allowed yourself to grow, to evolve, to transform into someone who no longer depends on their recognition for validation. Your silence, your patience, and your healing are not punishments. They are your power. And in that growth lies the ultimate reversal. The avoidant may have tried to control the story, avoid the discomfort, and escape the connection. But you chose clarity, presence, and self-respect. You are no longer the person who tolerated what didn't serve you. You are the person who understood your worth and refused to settle for anything less. So the real lesson here isn't about their loss. It's about your evolution. It's about understanding that emotional strength, self-awareness, and growth are not conditional on anyone else's choices. They are your birthright. And the most profound transformation happens not when someone finally recognizes your value, but when you fully realize it yourself. Because when that happens, regret becomes powerless, absence becomes irrelevant, and growth becomes unstoppable. Never forget, they may realize too late what they lost, but you will never be too late to reclaim yourself.